With an increase in the real interest rate, consumption and real gross domestic product will most likely change in which of the following ways? So in this situation, we're told that there is an increase in the real interest rate, and we're asked to find how the consumption and real gross domestic product will change. So, to answer this question, we'll first have to consider the investment demand curve. The investment demand curve looks like the following, where the x-axis represents the quantity of investments, or the number of investments, and the y-axis represents the interest rate. And the curve is a downward sloping curve to represent how the number of investments decreases as the interest rate increases, or vice versa. So, initially our investment or interest rate is at this point here, and we're told in the situation that the interest rate increases. So we could represent this increase in interest rate by labeling this as the new interest rate and seeing where it maps onto the curve. So that would be right here. And we can see now that initially the number of investments was out here, or this number E. But after the increase in the real interest rate, the number of investments decreases to E prime. So overall, we can see that the investments decreases as the interest rate increases. Now, because of this relationship, we must now analyze the aggregate demand versus aggregate supply model to highlight how the consumption and real gross domestic product will change as a result. So for this curve, the x-axis represents the real GDP, and the y-axis represents the price level. For this curve, there are two sloping curves. The downward sloping curve represents the aggregate demand, and the upward sloping curve represents the short-run aggregate supply. Now we're told that the interest rate would increase, and because of that increase in interest rate, we saw that the investments would decrease. Because investments are a part of the aggregate demand, that means the aggregate demand will also decrease. And to represent this decrease in aggregate demand, we will shift this curve to the left. This will be the AD2 curve. And now from this we can see that the real GDP, or real gross domestic product, was initially out here. But after the increase in the real interest rate, the real GDP, or real gross domestic product, is down here. So there's a decrease in real gross domestic product. And because consumption follows this change in real gross domestic product, then the consumption must also decrease. Therefore, we can tell that answer choices A, B, and C are incorrect because they show either an increase in consumption or an increase in real gross domestic product. E is incorrect because it shows a no change in consumption and an increase in real gross domestic product. Therefore, D is the correct answer because it properly shows how there's a decrease in both consumption and real gross domestic product.